I invite you to stand for the reading of the Gospel. Which has been echoing in our minds already as we have heard, being led by the youth. This is the first few verses of John chapter 1 to 18. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of flesh or of the will of a human, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a parent's only child, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law was given indeed through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the parent's heart, who has made God known. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Mr. Hudson, my high school geometry teacher at Presbyterian Pan American High School, once shared a story which has stayed with me all of these years. He described a place called Flatland, in which all things existed, but only in two dimensions. Think of it like a thin piece of paper on which all sorts of two-dimensional creatures lived. There were squares and triangles, polygons, simple lines. They interacted with each other, but only in that flat level. So if a line was speaking to a square, that line might look to the square like a single dot if that line was pointing at it straight on. Or it might look like an actual line if it was broadside. Once every 1,000 years, a mystical event took place, and the beginning of a millennium was upon them. The inhabitants of Flatland gathered in a large expanse at the center of town to witness this event. And it happened that a single dot, out of nowhere, suddenly appeared in their midst. And the crowd stepped away from this mysterious dot. It was a good thing the crowd retreated because that dot began to grow. No longer it was just a simple dot. Now it began to be a little tiny circle, and then it became bigger and bigger. And as the circle continued to grow, the crowd continued to step back and witness this miracle. And the circle didn't speak to the inhabitants of Flatland. It was just there to be witnessed. And the circle grew so large that it encompassed the entire center of town. And the crowd was worried because how large it had gotten, and they wondered if it might start to push against the palace and the other buildings in the land. And the crowd's feeling went from marvel and awe to fear. And just then the circle began to shrink, getting smaller and smaller at the same pace it had grown. And the crowd closed in on that shrinking circle. Now as it began to be smaller and smaller, once again within the confines of that center of town, until it began to become a tiny dot. And then the tiny dot disappeared right before their eyes. And the flatland historians and philosophers and poets began to write about that event, and did so for the next 1,000 years, just as their ancestors had done for the previous 1,000 years. What no one in Flatland was able to grasp, because they couldn't understand it, was that they had been visited by a being from another dimension. Flatland was like a single sheet of paper just floating in the universe. And they had been visited by a sphere which had gone through Flatland, traveling through it, and in that process, when it intersected it, it first connected with just one single dot as the sphere was going through the plane. And then as it grew, they only could see the cross-section of the sphere, so they saw a circle grow larger and then smaller. And once the sphere went past that sheet of paper, the dot disappeared. But see, Flatlanders only knew 2 dimensions, so they couldn't picture a 3rd dimension. Within their knowledge, this is the only way their world made sense. So whatever had just happened there was mysterious. The story my geometry teacher told us was an adaptation from the plot of a book called Flatland by Edwin Abbott, written in 1884. It wasn't a bestseller in its day, but it has the distinction of being quoted by those who were trying to understand what Albert Einstein was teaching the world, that in our 3-dimensional perception of the world, we needed to be open to a 4th dimension, time, and then possibly to other dimensions yet to be discovered. Mr. Hudson's retelling of Flatland gives me an image to relate to when we read those first few verses of the Gospel of John. Because we don't have the words or the concepts to be able to explain that mystical beginning of the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. Mr. Hudson hadn't intended his storytelling only to make us think about geometry. It was a Presbyterian high school, and so he was trying to invite us to consider a theological angle to the story. See what I did there, the angle? What if we tried to understand the presence of God among us, and of Jesus in particular, like we were enlightened Flatlanders? What if we tried to expand our Flatland faith to have a vision of another dimension where God inhabits and to which God invites us? The scriptures today are part of a 3-Sunday series of thinking about important beginnings in our faith. Last week we talked about the moment of creation when God said, "Let there be light," and creation was set in motion. Today we go back to that beginning, but we see it from the mystical interaction of God and the Word. In the beginning was the Word. Next week we will revisit another beginning, and that is Pentecost, which we think about as the beginning of the church, the birthday of the church. In these beginning narratives, we honor that articulating our faith so often depends on stories, and we push at the limits of our language. And we sit in the tension of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And so in the story we read today, just like a fictional Flatland, there is an intersection of 2 realms. The gospel reading weaves all of the strands of the story of Jesus in those few verses. or as Jesus is referred to in this passage as the Word. The Greek word for that is logos. There was a Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, who first used the word logos around 600 years before Jesus to designate a divine reason or plan which coordinates the changing universe. When I was growing up, the Spanish Bible translation that we used in my church used a different term for logos. They called it the verb. I like that concept of action, of Jesus as a verb. And today our liturgy, we pondered the word and as light and as love. And this word interacted as a foreign entity with humanity, even though creation came to being through the word. And the word was misunderstood, even though it became the embodiment of God's love. And the word became flesh, even though we couldn't recognize that we were staring at the face of God. Look, I know that it would be hard for our multidimensional God to explain things to us flatlanders. And to be frank, the way God does things sometimes sounds weird. And really, it's more than weird. We could sort of deal with weird or eccentric. The geniuses of arts and sciences, we sometimes think of them as weird characters or eccentric, and we just shrug and you think, they're geniuses. They can be weird if they want. But the way in which God intersects with us through Jesus, makes us shake our head in puzzlement. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, names it. He calls God's approach foolishness. To us humans, the way God works, totally foolish. Did Paul just call God foolish? Is that thunder I hear in the distance? No. When measured by our human understanding, not only is God doing something odd, it is downright the opposite of what we think would be the right thing. What to us